Please join me as I dive into book bans in the United States and China. I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. So China and the United States at first glance seem very, very different, both culturally and politically. China is a communist country. It has an authoritarian government. The people do not have much of a voice in China. Everything is done by a central government and then by provinces, the kind of the state unit in China. And the United States is a government that claims to be against communism. You hear a lot in conservative media particularly about how communism is bad. And there are some indicators that the United States is going towards fascism, which is the opposite of communism. Yet, both China and the United States have had a huge upsurge in book bans in recent years. That started in the 2020s. And after COVID, pretty much. And again, these countries seem very dissimilar, but yet the book bans are really actually pretty strikingly similar. They're not similar in the process, so I'm going to talk about that for a minute. So in China, books are banned by government censors, and there's over 1 million censors in China. Of course, it's a huge country, it has over 1 billion people. But there are professional people who look at books, and the selection of books, the review of books, it is very, very well organized. This has been going on for a long time, really since the Communist Revolution in China. So books will come to China, and as they're imported or they go to schools, a censor will look at them. And sometimes they're looked at several times, especially if they're imported. But for example, before books came to the school that I worked at, or as they came to the school, someone at the school whose job it was to deal with this had to send the book censors a list. Based on that list, the book censors decided which books may not be appropriate. Those books had to be sent to the censor. Censor looked at them, and many times they would give the book back. They decided it was fine, and then sometimes the book would be kept and destroyed, and those were books that were deemed inappropriate. So it's very well organized in China. It's very well organized. And the United States is not as much so. So the United States, books can be challenged by community members and often by parents. A lot of times it's parents who will challenge the books. So, for example, Berkeley County, South Carolina, where I worked last year, actually made the national news because one parent challenged 93 books. It was actually 2023. It happened in 2023. And the parent challenged these 93 books. And all the books that she challenged came from what's called book lists. And this is someone's opinion. There are groups out there and individuals out there who contribute to this list. And I'll put the link to the list in the comments. Who decide what books they think are bad. And most of the book challenges are based on that list. And many of the people involved are part of what's called Moms for Liberty, which is a conservative group in the United States. And so parents challenge these books. Community members can also challenge, but it's usually parents. And they have to form committees. And it's a long and pretty arduous process, and it takes up a lot of time, energy, and money. Because these committees have to look at the books. In the case of Berkeley County, the committees looked at the books, and then the school board, which was largely conservative, decided that they didn't like the results of the committees, because the committees largely protected the books. They did not ban very many, and so they just started over. And now the state of South Carolina actually has a book banning process, and so there are statewide books that have to be banned. So very interesting, the differences. And there always has been censorship in the United States. It's been an ongoing thing, but the level of censorship has really risen in the last few years. PEN, which is a group that tracks books banning, estimates that over 10,000 books were banned last year. So it's a huge issue both in the United States and in China. But what's interesting to me is the content that is selected and the language used are really similar, despite the differences of these two countries. So I'll start with the language used. There's a whole emphasis on values and appropriateness. So in China, they talk about Chinese values. That means values that the country ascribes to. And those are traditional values, especially respect for the family, respect for the culture, patriotism, respect for the country at large. Those are all cited as Chinese values. And in the United States, values are referred to often as traditional values or as family values. And these, again, are considered things that are specific to American culture that respect the traditional family, meaning the nuclear family, the parents and the children, and that respect authority and that respect our nation. That's a huge thing in the conservative media. They wrote books that respect the United States as a country and that speak highly of the United States. So the idea of the value system is very, very similar. Even though, again, you would think these countries have really different value systems, the way that the countries are run and their origins and the histories are very different, but again, the language used is very similar. And also, the books that are targeted are very similar. So, in both China and the United States, there's a huge concern about LGBTQ, gay and lesbian characters, and the promotion of people being gay and lesbian. And China, it's the frequency of the frequency of gay and lesbianism in China is relatively low, at least publicly, because there's still such a stigma against it. It's much more of a stigma than the United States. Very, very low. And in the United States, of course, LGBTQ is accepted by a large proportion of the population. However, there is great concern in the United States by many groups because of this. They don't think that that's appropriate, especially Moms for Liberty and groups like that. The Heritage Foundation is another one. There are a lot of groups who just don't support LGBTQ. So a lot of books that are targeted in China and the United States are books that have LGBTQ characters. And as recently as probably 5 years ago in China, this was not a huge deal. They would have nonfiction books about LGBTQ at some of the Western libraries. It was not a big deal, but now it is. And in the United States, it's also a big deal. Many of the books that are banned have LGBTQ characters, and the reasoning is that they are obscene. Another thing that's really behind a lot of the book bans in both countries is the idea of promoting that country's culture above other countries and not having diverse viewpoints. So both China and the United States, books from foreign authors are largely challenged or banned. In China, there cannot no longer be any English textbooks written outside of China used for English teaching, which seems absurd because China's first language is not English. Of course, you would want materials from other countries, but that's out of this concern that they have to have Chinese culture presented as the best way. And in the United States, many seemingly innocent books, books that don't have a lot of things that might be considered inappropriate are being banned. And those are books that are largely by Black or Latino authors, or that feature characters from diverse viewpoints. So the big example that I have is The House on Mango Street. And this is a book that it's very easy to read. It's in the form of poetry, and it talks about a girl's experience growing up. And looking at it, there's very little that you can argue with. And even in the book looks, it was only a 2 out of 4. And I think it was 4 being the highest, the most obscene or the most inappropriate, and 1 being nothing. And I think there was something about parental authority, about how, there was lack of parental authority in the book, and that somebody went to jail. That was considered obscene in recognizing that people go to jail in this country, and they do a lot. And that was one of the books that was up for banning in South Carolina. And I couldn't figure out why. But it was a book that portrayed a largely Latino neighborhood, an inner city neighborhood. And therefore it was deemed dangerous because it was not promoting the traditional family and the traditional culture. And again, this is something that in the United States they won't come out and say, oh, it's because it's a Latino book. They made up these things about how it had a character for going to jail, and there are fights. It said something about there were fights between some of the characters. You have fist fights, ridiculousness, really. But that was used as a pretext to try to ban this book, and that's been a very, very challenged book. And again, looking at it just from an objective standpoint, you wouldn't understand why. The other thing that's really challenged in both of these countries when it comes to book bans are the nation's history. And in China, this is very much a thing that's been, since the revolution, it's been very, very censored what type of history is taught. And they're very, very concerned when it comes to books that only history that is positive to China is taught. And it goes to the point where it seems a little extreme. For example, I ordered a book because I thought the students could relate to it, and they really liked learning about ancient China. So I ordered a book that talked about Genghis Khan and the Mongol invasion of China. And that book was banned. The censor took it because it talked about another group of people invading China. And it did not speak about China in, glowing terms. Again, that seems like very benign, not anything big, but it was. Because anything that challenges the narrative of China as always being strong, and the Chinese people as being, just the best, is challenged. And in the United States, we're starting to see this too. There is a big concern, especially with children books for younger children. There's a concern, and again, it's kind of hidden in the guise of protecting children's mental health, particularly white children. It's in this guise of not making white children feel bad for studying, when studying history. As most people know, the United States has a very, very complex history, especially when it comes to people of other ethnicities and races. We've had slavery, we've had segregation, and that is that's something that many Americans, particularly conservative Americans, are still not comfortable with. And so a lot of book banning has concerned these books that teach history in a way that doesn't speak of the United States very glowingly. The best example of that I have is the story of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Goes to School is the name of the picture book. Ruby Bridges was a young girl, true life character, and she was a young girl who challenged segregation in the 1950s. And her court case was what led to desegregation of all schools. So it's a very important story. It's a story that children should know, because it has affected their lives so much. We have integrated schools now, in large part because of Ruby. But that book was challenged, and in some places banned, because they said it was just age inappropriate, that small children should not have to read about this. And some parents said, it made my white child feel bad. That was the idea. So really, the selection of materials and the reasoning behind it are actually eerily similar with the two countries, which is very unusual and very interesting to me. That during this time period, two seemingly opposite societies could have similar views and do similar things. It's just very interesting. So I want to hear from you if you've had experience with the book banning in your country or your culture, or you've seen this in the context of your school. If you have any questions or comments, please comment below, and I will have a discussion with you on this, because this is a very interesting subject in these times that are rapidly changing, particularly in the United States. Things are rapidly changing politically and culturally. So that's all for today. If you're interested in policy and education globally, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time, keep learning.